Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I've got a story for you that's a little different, a slow burn tale about silence, family, and the quiet power of truth. If you enjoy stories that get under your skin, stick around. And if you do, please consider hitting that like button and maybe even subscribe and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. My name is Rowan Sinclair, and I've spent most of my adult life behind a bench, listening to lies unravel. You'd think I'd be immune to cruelty by now. My days are a parade of it, greed dressed up as desperation, malice disguised as a mistake. I've seen men who built empires on fraud weep like children when their ledgers were laid bare. I've watched families tear each other apart over inheritances that were poisoned long before the ink was dry on the will. I am a professional observer of the human capacity for deceit, a connoisseur of the subtle tells, the slight tremor in a voice, the darting of a guilty eye. You'd think I'd be immune, but nothing hardens you quite like the kind that comes wrapped in a designer dress and a sister's smile. The engagement party was an exercise in opulent cliché. It was held at an exclusive country club on the coast, a place with old money bones and new money aspirations. Crystal flutes, filled with champagne that cost more per bottle than my first car, clinked beneath sprawling, ostentatious chandeliers. Music, a live string quartet of course, hummed from a corner, a genteel soundtrack for a room full of practiced smiles. Her fiancé's family, the Sterlings, were everywhere. Perfect teeth, perfect posture, perfect, blissful ignorance. They moved with the unthinking confidence of people who have never had a door closed in their face, their laughter light and airy, untroubled by the weight of the world. And then there was me, the older sister no one bothered to introduce properly. The one they called quiet, as if that were an insult and not a carefully cultivated defense mechanism. The one my sister, Stella, still saw as a socially awkward bookworm in second-hand clothes, a relic from a past she had worked tirelessly to Photoshop and filter. I had arrived precisely on time, 5 minutes early, a habit ingrained from years of court schedules. I was dressed in an understated, tailored black dress, my uniform, in and out of court. It was a silent statement of seriousness in a room frothing with pastels and sequins. As I crossed the gleaming marble floor toward the champagne table, my sister's eyes found mine across the room. She was holding court, naturally, the sun around which all the other guests orbited in adoring thrall. She looked at me, tilted her head ever so slightly, a gesture she'd perfected since childhood, and smiled. It was not the kind of smile that welcomes. It was a masterpiece of social engineering, a smile that said, "You're not supposed to be here. This world isn't for you. Bless your heart for trying." She then leaned into her perfectly coiffed friends, whispered something behind a manicured hand, and they all turned to glance at me. Their looks were a cocktail of emotions I knew well, curiosity, amusement, and a swift, cool dismissal. I didn't flinch. I held my composure with the same steadiness I use when a lawyer tries to grandstand in my courtroom. I've heard murderers try to charm a jury with less subtlety. But that night, standing under the soft, judgmental glow of those chandeliers, a profound and weary realization settled over me. The worst betrayals, the deepest cuts, don't come from strangers or enemies. They come from the people who have had a lifetime to study your anatomy, the people who know exactly where to aim. People often assume that silence means weakness, that if you don't fight back with noise and fury, you must not have the strength. But the truth is, some of us learned early on that being invisible was safer. It was cleaner. It was, for a long time, the only way to survive. Growing up with Stella was an education in making myself small. She was the supernova, and I was the dark matter essential, but unseen. She was the bright one, the charming one, the one who knew how to let her lower lip tremble just enough to get what she wanted. Our parents doted on her like she was a fragile, priceless artifact. My mother's favorite phrase, repeated like a mantra, was that Stella had such a way with people. "She just sparkles." Mom would sigh with admiration, usually after Stella had managed to talk her way out of trouble for breaking a vase or failing a math test. I remember one instance with crystalline clarity. I was 16, Stella was 14. She'd taken our mother's car without permission to go to a party, and on the way back, she'd scraped the entire passenger side against a stone wall. She came into my room that night, her eyes wide with real, unfeigned panic. She begged me to help her. "Please, Rowan," she'd cried, "Dad will kill me. He'll never let me out of the house again." I, being the ever-responsible older sister, stayed up half the night with a clay bar and polishing compound, trying to buff out the worst of the damage. The next morning, when my father saw the remaining scratches, his face turned to thunder. Before I could say a word, Stella burst into tears and pointed a trembling finger at me. She said I took the car. She said I was jealous because she had a date and I didn't. She said I'd done it to get her in trouble. And our parents, they looked from my stunned, silent face to her heaving, photogenic sobs, and they believed her. My father grounded me for a month. My mother told me she was deeply disappointed in my vindictiveness. Stella got a sympathy shopping trip. I never said a word in my own defense. What was the point? The verdict was already in. I learned then that truth was not a fact, it was a performance. And I was not a performer. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the serious one. The too intense child who preferred reading in a corner to playing outside, the one who corrected our third-grade teacher on a point of grammar and was rewarded with a week of scorn from my classmates. I didn't sparkle, I absorbed. I read, I listened, I watched. By the time we were in high school, the narrative was set in stone. Stella was the social queen, and I was the resident ghost. She'd host loud, sprawling parties in our house on weekends when our parents were away, parties I was never invited to attend. I'd stay in my room, the bass from the stereo vibrating through my floorboards, and disappear into textbooks on constitutional law. Once, I overheard her telling a group of her friends in the hallway that I was adopted. Our parents felt sorry for the library, she'd said, so they took its quietest resident home. They all erupted in derisive laughter. At the dinner table, that sentiment was often echoed by our parents, albeit in a kinder, more dismissive tone. Rowan just doesn't know how to let loose. Mom would chuckle, nudging Dad, who would grunt in agreement without ever looking up from his plate. His silence was a different kind from mine. Mine was a shield, his was an abdication. A quiet refusal to engage, to parent to see. No one ever asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. No one cared where I went after school as long as I wasn't causing problems. So I didn't. I studied. I built a fortress for myself out of case law and legal precedent. I found solace in the clear, cold logic of the law, a world where facts mattered, where arguments had to be supported by evidence, where truth, at least in theory, could be methodically proven. I learned how to dismantle an argument piece by piece, without ever raising my voice. While Stella was chasing fraternity boys and botching her public relations degree with a C average, I graduated high school a year early and received a full scholarship to a prestigious law school on the other side of the country. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. It was thick and heavy, full of promise. I brought it into the kitchen where my mother and Stella were looking at fabric swatches for new curtains. I held it out, my heart doing a nervous flutter in my chest. I got in, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My mother took it, her eyes scanning the letterhead. "Oh, law school," she said, her tone flat as if I'd announced I was taking up macrame. "That's nice, dear." She handed the letter back to me and turned back to Stella. "Now, do you think this Paisley is too busy?" Stella rolled her eyes, not even bothering to look up from a swatch of garish floral print. So she asked, "You're officially going to be one of those courtroom women with no life, huh? Good luck with that." I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I packed my bags a month later and never looked back. The day I left, my father shook my hand awkwardly at the door. My mother gave me a brief, papery hug and told me to remember to call on holidays. Stella didn't even come downstairs. After graduation, I moved to the East Coast, clerked for a formidable federal judge who was known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue, and then joined the U.S. Attorney's Office. I prosecuted complex financial fraud cases, the kind of unglamorous, paper-heavy work that makes your eyes burn and your social life wither. But I was good at it. My name, Rowan Sinclair, began to mean something in the legal community. It meant thorough. It meant relentless. It meant better have your story straight, because I would find the one loose thread in your narrative and pull until your entire fabrication unraveled. At 38, after years of grueling work, I was nominated for a federal judgeship. The confirmation process was a trial by fire, but I emerged on the other side. I was appointed to the bench, the youngest in my district at the time. The city newspaper did a feature. My name was on the front page of the Metro section, right below a large, serious photo of me standing on the courthouse steps, my black robe draped over my arm. I sent a copy home to my parents. No one called. The silence from them wasn't shocking. By then, it was just a fact, like gravity. I had learned the crucial difference between distance and peace. It didn't hurt the way it used to. I had my courtroom. I had my chambers. I had a life I had built, brick by painstaking brick, with my own 2 hands. I wore my title, Your Honor, like a suit of armor, and I used my voice to cut through the suffocating nonsense of liars and thieves. In my courtroom, people listened when I spoke. In my family, I was still just the older sister. I only saw Stella a handful of times after that. Obligatory appearances at weddings, a cousin's funeral, the occasional Christmas where my mother would beg us to please just pretend you're still close, just for one day. Stella would show up in a whirlwind of sequins and stilettos, always with a new, dramatic story about how utterly exhausting her social life was, how hard it was to find a reliable caterer, how her trip to Tuscany was almost ruined by a subpar tour guide. I would sit at the far end of the table, a silent observer, watching her perform. It fascinated me how someone could be so full of noise and yet say absolutely nothing of substance. Our conversations were brief and superficial. She'd ask if I was still doing that boring law thing. I'd nod. She'd pat my hand and say, well, someone has to do the serious stuff, I guess, before turning to regale the table with another anecdote. We hadn't spoken in over a year when the invitation arrived at my chambers. It was a glossy, cream-colored envelope with silver foil trim, ostentatiously thick. It was scented, of course, with some cloying, expensive floral perfume that made my clerk sneeze. Inside, an engraved card read, "Join us in celebrating the engagement of Stella Sinclair and Preston Sterling." There was no personal touch. No mention of me on the invite, no +1, not even a handwritten note scrawled on the back. It was as impersonal as a utility bill. A few days later, the follow-up text came, a message that was somehow both an olive branch and a slap in the face. "Hi sis, just FYI, don't feel like you have to come if you're busy. Preston's family is a little high profile, so it's going to be a whole thing. Try not to wear anything too somber. Okay. XXXS. Too somber." That line stayed with me for days. It echoed in my chambers as I reviewed briefs for a RICO case. It hung in the air as I sentenced a man for embezzling millions from a pension fund. Too somber. She had no idea what somber was. She had no idea how serious my life had become. She couldn't conceive of the weight of the decisions I made every single day, of the lives I had irrevocably changed with the swing of a gavel. She couldn't imagine powerful men in custom-tailored suits calling me Your Honor with voices that trembled with fear. To her, I was still that girl in second-hand clothes, clinging to books and formality as a shield against a world she navigated with effortless, unthinking grace. She didn't know me at all, but that was the core of it, wasn't it? They never asked. They were content with the caricature they had drawn of me 30 years ago, and in that moment, something inside me shifted, a quiet, tectonic plate that had been dormant for decades. I was tired, not of my work, but of their narrative. I was tired of being the silent, somber footnote in the sparkling story of their lives. So I bought a dress. Simple, black, devastatingly elegant. A dress that didn't shout but spoke in a firm, clear voice. It was a dress that cost a sum Stella would appreciate, for reasons she would never understand. I booked a first-class flight. I rented a luxury sedan. I declined the hotel room Stella had condescendingly offered in a follow-up text, in case you can't afford a decent place, and made my own arrangements at a discreet 5-star hotel downtown. And then, for the first time in a decade, I walked back into the lion's den. But this time I had no intention of shrinking. I wasn't going for her. I wasn't even going for them. I was going for the silence, the one that had followed me for years, and the one I was, at long last, ready to break. The valet, a young man with a practiced, deferential smile, took my keys. The country club was a monument to curated perfection. Manicured hedges shaped into flawless globes, sweeping lawns that rolled down to the sea, a stone clubhouse that looked like it had been airlifted from the English countryside. Stella's name was printed in a flowing silver script on the welcome sign, followed by Preston's in a slightly smaller, more traditional font. That little detail told me everything I needed to know about their dynamic. I arrived 5 minutes early, a creature of habit. I watched from the car as guests trickled in, a river of silk and cashmere. They hugged, they laughed, they adjusted heirloom cufflinks and dresses that still had the faint crease of their boutique packaging. Stella had always been obsessed with projecting status, even when she was using our parents' credit card to do it. I imagined she'd spun a charming, carefully edited narrative for Preston's family, one where she was the elegant, well-connected socialite, and her older sister was a vaguely unfortunate, rigid creature who was best kept in the shadows. And then I walked in. There was no announcement, no gasp, just a polite nod from the hostess who handed me a champagne flute and said, "Welcome." Her voice was cool and distant. She had no idea who I was. Perfect. The room was buzzing with the specific frequency of money and influence. People in polished shoes and practiced smiles floated from one conversational cluster to another, their laughter calibrated for public consumption. I stayed near the back, sipping my champagne, a silent observer in my natural habitat. I watched how easily everyone fell into orbit around Stella. She was magnificent, I'll admit that. Her sequin dress caught the light like a shattered mirror, and her laughter, loud and musical, was the dominant sound in the room. But beauty and character, as I knew better than most, have never had much to do with each other. I caught sight of our parents across the room. My father's hair was grayer, but he still had that same passive, disconnected expression he wore through most of our childhoods. Present, but not involved. My mother, on the other hand, was beaming. She was wearing a dress far too young for her and a pearl necklace I recognized. I had sent it to her for her 60th birthday 3 years ago. It had been ruinously expensive. She had never once acknowledged receiving it. Now, here it was, proudly displayed. She saw me. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a polite confusion, as if she were trying to place a vaguely familiar face from a distant past. Then she turned back to her friends. Not a word, not even a wave. I found an empty seat at a corner table, partially shielded by one of the oversized orchid arrangements. It was better this way. They didn't want me visible, and for the first time I didn't want to be seen through their eyes anymore. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reviewing a case file. The facts were all there, laid out before me. Then Stella found me. She was in full hostess mode, gliding through the room, trailing air kisses and soft, fake laughter. When her eyes landed on me, something behind them tightened. "Well, look who made it," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet performative warmth. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Didn't think this kind of scene was really your thing." "It usually isn't," I replied, matching her smile with a cool, placid one of my own. "But I had the time." She gestured to my dress with a raised eyebrow. "Black, huh? A bold choice for an engagement party." I didn't bother explaining that black was the color of gavels and robes, the color of finality, the color I wore when I wanted to be taken seriously. I knew better than to offer depth to people who only came to skim the surface. I figured someone needed to ground the palate, I said instead. She blinked, clearly unsure if I was being sarcastic. Sarcasm was a language she didn't speak. Then she leaned in, her cloying perfume enveloping me. "Just try not to make things awkward, okay?" Preston's family is, they're very big on appearances. They ask a lot of questions. I held her gaze, my own unwavering. Then maybe they'll get real answers. That was enough to make her laugh, a loud, theatrical sound designed to dismiss my comment as a joke. "Classic Rowan," she trilled, always so intense. She flitted off before I could reply, already mid-giggle with someone in heels too high to walk in. I exhaled slowly and took a deliberate sip of my drink. There it was again. That word. Intense. A lifetime of being called too much when all I ever tried to be was enough. Preston, the fiancé, approached me later during dinner. I was alone at a large, round table intended for 10, a solitary island in a sea of conviviality. I was picking at a plate of seared tuna that had gone cold. He looked exactly like his family's bank portfolio, robust, polished, and utterly confident. He was tall, smooth, careful. The kind of man who shook hands with both of his and probably practiced looking empathetic in the mirror. "Rowan, right?" he asked, sliding into the chair beside me. "Stella's sister." I nodded. "That's me." He smiled, but it was a politician's smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "She doesn't talk about you much. I wasn't sure if you two were close." I tilted my head, letting the silence hang for a beat. "We're sisters," I said, leaving the term to do its own work. He chuckled, a short, uncertain sound. "Right. She said you do something. In the legal field?" I met his gaze, something like that. There was a flicker of what might have been curiosity in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by a lack of interest. He asked nothing further. Stella had likely filled his head with some diluted, palatable version of my life. Maybe a paralegal, maybe a compliance officer in a dreary government office. Anything but the truth, which was fine. Some truths are like verdicts. You don't hand them out before the trial's over. Dinner gave way to speeches. One by one, Stella's friends rose to the microphone, giggling through toasts full of saccharine childhood memories and compliments so sweet they bordered on diabetic. It was all a performance, a social ritual designed to make people feel important by association. Laugh in the right places, sip on cue, smile for the camera. Stella soaked it all in like a thirsty plant, her polished laughter floating through the room. I stayed seated at my table at the far end of the hall, partly obscured by a centerpiece of white calla lilies. They made it easy to be invisible. At one point, I overheard a woman at the next table, one of Preston's aunts, ask him if Stella had any siblings. He shrugged, sipping his drink. She does, he said, his voice carrying in a lull in the conversation, an older sister. But they're not close. The sister is very serious, works some kind of government job. I think it's in records. I didn't even flinch. That was their story. It had always been their story. I was the distant one. The cold, stern, somber one. Never mind that Stella hadn't returned a birthday call in 5 years. Never mind that I had flown across the country for our mother's surgery and was asked by my own mother to wait outside the recovery room so Stella could have her space to be emotional for the visitors. Let them tell it how they liked. I'd lived long enough to know the vast, unbridgeable chasm between truth and narrative. And then Stella stood up. She tapped her glass with her fork, the clear, high-pitched ring cutting through the chatter. All eyes swiveled toward her. The spotlight from the chandelier glinted off her sequin dress like a warning flare. She took center stage as if it were her birthright. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said, beaming, her voice thick with practiced emotion. Truly, I feel so lucky to be surrounded by so much love. The crowd smiled back. Some already had their phones raised, ready to capture what they assumed would be another charming, self-effacing speech. "I know this may come as a shock," she went on, giggling. "But I wasn't always this put together." A ripple of soft, indulgent laughter. Preston smiled, leaning back in his chair, the picture of a proud fiancé. In fact, Stella continued, growing up, I was the wild one. My sister, Rowan, was the opposite. She was, let's just say, very strict, very by the book. She once filed a formal complaint with our parents because I borrowed her sweater without asking. I was 13. Laughter erupted around the room. I stayed perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I remembered that sweater. It wasn't a sweater. It was a pearl necklace my grandmother had left me, her only namesake. Stella hadn't borrowed it. She had taken it, worn it to a party, and come home without it, having traded it for a cheap bracelet from a boy she liked. The formal complaint was me, crying in my room for a week. "She's always been that way," Stella said, waving her hand dismissively, a gesture of magnanimous pity. Judgy. Rigid. Honestly, I'm just grateful she showed up tonight. She's not big on family gatherings or, smiling. She looked right at me then, across the sea of faces, and held my gaze just long enough for the insult to land. Then she winked. A shared joke that I was not in on. My fork rested lightly beside my untouched entree. The room felt very quiet to me, a pocket of silence and a storm of noise. Preston nudged her. "Be nice," he said with a broad, harmless grin. Then he turned his grin toward me, as if including me in a harmless inside joke at my own expense. "But really," he added, turning fully in his chair to face me, "we're lucky she made time. I mean, Stella said you work in. What was it? County records, or maybe it was admin," he added as an afterthought. "Either way, sounds like important paperwork." There it was, the final exhibit. The insult wasn't even intentionally cruel. It was worse. It was condescendingly small, an erasure spoken so casually it didn't even sting. It just clarified. Stella looked pleased, her smile stretching like a cat's, basking in the warm glow of the assumption that I would, as always, swallow it in silence. I carefully wiped the corner of my mouth with my napkin. I took a slow sip of water. Then I met Preston's gaze. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm, clear, and carrying in the expectant quiet. "Where did you hear that?" He blinked, his smile faltering. "Stella said something about you working in a government office. Office work." I didn't answer right away. I let the moment stretch. In my courtroom, I use silence as a tool. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes them rush to fill it, often with the truth. I let the pressure build in the space where their confidence used to sit. "No," I said finally, my voice still soft, but now imbued with a weight that made several people at nearby tables turn their heads. "That's not correct." Stella laughed, a nervous, brittle sound this time. "Oh, Rowan, don't be so dramatic. It's just a job." "She's right," I said, still looking directly at Preston, refusing to let him off the hook. "I don't work in office administration." Another pause, longer this time. The air in the room grew thick. "I'm a federal judge," I said. The silence that followed was immediate, profound, and absolute. It was like the room had collectively inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. From a table to my left, a man's voice, sharp and clear, broke through. "Wait, Judge Sinclair." Heads turned. Someone near the front gasped. A woman in a green dress, a lawyer I recognized from a major firm in the city, narrowed her eyes. From the Vanguard financial case, she whispered, but the whisper carried like a shout in the stillness. I heard it. So did Stella. Preston stared at me, really stared at me for the first time. It was like he was seeing something under the surface of a painting he'd owned for years but never truly examined. Something he hadn't realized was there. You're a judge. He asked, but this time there was no grin, no easy charm. His voice was flat with disbelief. I nodded once, a single, deliberate motion. U.S. District Court, Southern District. His hand, which had been resting on Stella's back, dropped to his side. But Stella said. She said you never really made it far, that you were. I didn't wait for him to finish the lie. The man in the sharp suit near the bar spoke up again, his voice louder now, full of dawning recognition. She handled that whole securities fraud trial. The sentencing got national coverage. More murmurs rippled through the room. A different kind of buzz now, not of social chatter, but of information being rapidly processed. Phones, which had been out to record Stella's charming speech, were now being used for a different purpose. Google searches were being launched beneath the fine linen tablecloths. One man unconsciously straightened his tie. A woman who had been laughing loudly at Stella's joke about the sweater now looked deeply, profoundly sheepish. And Stella. Her face had gone through a rapid, fascinating series of transformations. The confident smirk had dissolved into confusion, then morphed into a pale, cornered panic. She looked from me to Preston to the whispering guests, her performer's mask cracking under the glare of an unexpected spotlight. I didn't know she was still doing that, she muttered to Preston, her voice a thin, reedy thing. I thought she gave it up. I stood then, not abruptly but slowly with purpose. I folded my linen napkin and set it gently on my plate next to my untouched food. Every move I made seemed to carry an immense weight now, not because I forced it, but because the weight had always been there. They just had never been equipped to see it. I met Preston's stunned eyes one last time. When people don't ask questions, I said softly, but my voice carried to every silent corner of that room. They shouldn't be surprised by the answers. Stella opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked desperately toward our parents. They looked just as stunned as everyone else. My mother's lips were slightly parted, the pearl necklace at her throat suddenly looking like a piece of evidence. My father had gone chalky white. For the first time in my memory, he was looking directly at me. I walked past them all, past the shocked whispers and the sideways glances and the melting facades of their perfect evening. There was no need for drama, no theatrics, just the quiet, undeniable gravity of the truth. I didn't need to explain myself. The verdict, it seemed, had already been delivered. I didn't stay for dessert. There was nothing more to be said, nothing sweeter than the clean, crisp silence I left behind me. Outside, the night air felt cool and clean against my skin. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention. It just exists, steady and real. I gave the valet my ticket and waited for my car, not turning back. There was no applause, no farewell, just the satisfying crunch of gravel under the tires as I drove away. As I left the manicured grounds of the club and merged onto the highway, freedom tasted like salt air and solitude. My phone, which had been silent on the table, buzzed once, then again. A missed call from my mother, 2 texts from Stella. I pulled over when it was safe and read them. The first, you should have told me. A perfect deflection, a shifting of blame. The second, why would you embarrass me like that? An admission, not of her lie but of her shame, an acknowledgement that the truth, my truth, was an embarrassment to her carefully constructed world. As if facts were weapons, as if telling the truth when asked was an attack. I didn't respond. I put the phone back in my purse and continued driving. They hadn't asked who I was for 20 years. They had assumed, projected, and reduced me to the version that made them feel more comfortable, more benevolent, bigger. And when the truth finally came out, not through my anger but through their own arrogance, they didn't feel remorse. They felt exposed. And I realized with a clarity that was as sharp and clean as the night air that I wasn't angry. Not anymore. There was a time I would have given anything to be acknowledged by them, to be invited into their circle of pride. But somewhere along the way, in the quiet solitude of my chambers, in the endless pages of briefs and transcripts, I had stopped needing that. What I had built didn't require their blessing. I had earned every inch of my life with no shortcuts, no applause, and no family name pulling strings for me. Just work. Quiet, consistent, unglamorous work. The kind that holds real weight in rooms they would never enter. Inside that clubhouse, I imagined the buzz was still palpable. Stella, desperately rewriting her own narrative to her new, suddenly wary in-laws. Preston, realizing his smugness had firm limits and that he was about to marry into a story far more complicated than he had been sold. My parents, sitting quietly, unsure how to process the existence of a daughter they had never bothered to understand. But I didn't need their understanding anymore. I didn't need their apology. They hadn't failed to see me because I was invisible. They had failed because they never truly looked. Now, for better or worse, they would. And even if they never said another word about it, never admitted they were wrong, something had irrevocably changed. Not because I had demanded it, but because truth, once it's let out of its cage, has a way of permanently shifting the air in a room. I didn't need the spotlight. I had never wanted center stage. All I ever wanted was my seat at the bench, and the quiet, lasting power of finally being seen. So that's the story. A little victory, maybe, but a quiet one. It just goes to show you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just own your truth and let the chips fall where they may. Thanks again for listening. If you liked it, please hit that thumbs up, and I'd be honored if you desubscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.